The morning sun over Miami painted the horizon in warm tones that suggested nothing but routine. For ValuJet Flight 592, a short hop to Atlanta, the day appeared straightforward. The aircraft waiting at the gate, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9-32, stood ready for boarding, its white fuselage shimmering lightly under the heat rising from the tarmac. To the casual observer, it was just another departure, one among hundreds leaving South Florida that Saturday. Yet beneath the surface of this ordinary moment lay the first threads of a chain of events that would tighten with brutal precision. The crew, the maintenance workers, the ground staff, each believed they were participating in an operation that was safe, controlled, and familiar. That illusion would not survive the hour. Inside the cockpit, Captain Candlin Kubeck, one of ValuJet's most experienced pilots, ran through pre-flight checks with calm efficiency. Her voice, steady and deliberate, filled the confined space as she worked down the checklist. First Officer Richard Hazen, younger but equally focused, verified system statuses as switches clicked and indicator lights blinked their confirmations. Everything on the flight deck appeared normal. The DC-9 had its quirks, like any aircraft of its generation, but the crew had no reason to suspect that, deep in the belly of the plane, conditions were already shifting toward catastrophe. At the rear of the aircraft, cargo was being loaded. Among the items going on board were several cardboard boxes containing old chemical oxygen generators, devices designed to produce breathable oxygen for passengers during decompressions. These particular canisters had been removed from other aircraft due for maintenance. They were spent, expired, considered scrap, but they were also dangerous when mishandled. Each device contained a core of chemical compounds that, once triggered, could burn at extremely high temperatures for nearly half an hour. If properly stored, the danger was manageable. If improperly packaged and mislabeled, the devices became disguised incendiary bombs. That morning, they were being placed into Flight 592's forward cargo hold, a compartment not equipped with fire suppression systems. The boxes were marked as company material, a vague designation that did not reveal the true hazard inside. And as loaders pushed the containers into the hold, nobody verified the condition of the canisters or the integrity of the safety caps meant to prevent accidental ignition. Some caps were missing entirely. Others were loosely attached. The risk was invisible but immediate. On the surface, however, the operation moved smoothly. Passengers boarded, greeting flight attendants with the casual optimism that accompanies weekend travel. The mood inside the cabin was quiet, almost serene. Parents settled children into seats. Business travelers scanned newspapers, and tourists gazed out the windows toward the Everglades stretching to the west. Nothing betrayed the fact that the aircraft carried the seeds of a disaster that would unfold within minutes of departure. When the doors closed and the engine spooled up, the DC-9 rolled away from the gate, engines humming with mechanical confidence. To the crew, the takeoff was routine. The climb out from Miami International Airport was uneventful, with the aircraft ascending through humid Florida air. Radio communications were crisp, professional, free of tension. At 2:10 p.m., Flight 592 was cleared to climb to 10,000 feet. Captain Kubeck acknowledged the instruction. Her voice remained steady, composed. But down below, in the dark cargo hold sealed beneath the passengers' feet, something had begun. One of the oxygen generators had likely shifted, rubbing or striking against another surface hard enough to remove its safety pin. The initiation was small, an internal chemical reaction that produced oxygen and heat. The device activated as if responding to an emergency that did not exist. Fueled by its own chemical energy, it began to burn intensely, emitting scorching heat and pressurized oxygen, an accelerant capable of turning anything nearby into fuel. Cardboard burst into flames. Plastic wrappings melted. Items stored near the boxes ignited as the temperature spiked far beyond what the cargo liner could withstand. Within seconds, the fire grew self-sustaining, feeding on materials never meant to encounter such thermal force. The sealed hold, starved of ventilation and lacking extinguishing systems, transformed into an oven of toxic smoke and violent heat. Still unaware, the crew continued their climb. Inside the cockpit, no alarm warned them of the inferno building beneath the floor. The DC-9's design incorporated smoke detectors in some areas, but not in the forward cargo hold. The pilots had no reason to believe anything was wrong until a faint smell, an acrid, chemical odor, drifted into the cabin. Passengers began coughing. Flight attendants noticed the haze forming near the floor and moving rapidly toward the front of the aircraft. Within moments, they called the cockpit. The first words transmitted the urgency clearly. "We have a fire." For Captain Kubeck and First Officer Hazen, everything changed instantly. Flight 592 had become a race against time. They declared an emergency, informing air traffic control that they needed to return to Miami immediately. The controllers cleared the airspace, giving the aircraft priority. But turning back was only the first step. The fire was spreading faster than any of them could have anticipated. The smoke thickened in the cockpit, a physical reminder that the blaze was no longer confined. The pilots struggled to focus on instruments as the environment degraded around them. Their vision blurred, eyes stinging. The oxygen masks dropped into reach, but even with supplemental oxygen, communication became strained as the situation deteriorated. The aircraft began descending sharply. The pilots were fighting to stabilize it, to keep it flying long enough to reach the airport, but the controls started responding sluggishly. The fire was compromising electrical and hydraulic systems. Instrument readings flickered, warnings sounded, rapid tones layered on top of each other, each one a signal of another system under threat or failing entirely. The cockpit voice recorder captured the tension. Voices overlapped, alarms blared, and the pilots attempted to coordinate actions under extreme physical and cognitive stress. They were losing the battle against both time and systems degradation. Every second mattered, and every second made survival less likely. Behind them, in the cabin, the situation was far worse. Smoke filled the aisles. Heat radiated through the floor. Passengers were choking, some struggling to breathe, even with wet cloths pressed to their faces. The flight attendants, tasked with maintaining order in an impossible situation, tried to reassure them, but the fire's advance was relentless. Flames had breached the cabin floor in places, eating into structural components. In the cockpit, the stress mounted as the crew attempted to level the aircraft. The horizon tilted. The DC-9 rolled right, then left. Control inputs felt weak, as if the aircraft itself were resisting. The fire had likely destroyed critical wiring bundles, affecting the systems that kept the aircraft stable. As the pilots fought to maintain altitude, their emotional and cognitive bandwidth narrowed. They prioritized immediate survival tasks, but the combination of smoke inhalation, sensory overload, and system failures eroded their coordination. This was where CRM, the lifeline of cockpit teamwork, was stretched to its breaking point. In a well-functioning CRM environment, each pilot supports the other through task management, communication, and shared situational awareness. But Flight 592's environment had become hostile to those very principles. The fire robbed them of visibility. The alarms drowned out conversation. The rapid succession of failures overwhelmed checklist procedures designed for more gradual emergencies. And the sheer physical stress of breathing smoke and heat pushed them toward the limits of human cognitive performance. Yet they persisted. They attempted to call out airspeed, altitude, headings. They tried to divide tasks, one focusing on flying, the other on radios and troubleshooting. They attempted to re-establish control as the aircraft descended through 7,000 feet, then 5,000. But the DC-9's structural integrity was already compromised. The fire had weakened crucial components, and the right side of the fuselage began to lose its aerodynamic shape. The aircraft pitched downward. The Everglades stretched out below, green and vast, but unforgiving. The pilots made a final effort to pull the aircraft out of its dive, but the controls offered little response. The smoke grew so thick that the outside world nearly disappeared. At 2:13 p.m., just minutes after the first sign of trouble, Flight 592 was no longer in controlled flight. The aircraft plunged toward the wetlands, engines still producing thrust, but the structure unable to sustain flight. The descent rate increased rapidly, rendering recovery impossible. As the nose dropped sharply, the forces acting on the airframe exceeded its limits. The final seconds were a chaotic culmination of every failure, mechanical, procedural, and human, converging into a moment from which neither crew nor passengers could escape. The impact was instantaneous and absolute. When the DC-9 struck the swampy terrain of the Everglades, the aircraft disintegrated with violent force, fragmenting into thousands of pieces that scattered across the muddy water and thick sawgrass. The crash generated a plume of debris and mist that rose into the air for only a moment before the unforgiving stillness of the wetlands swallowed everything. No flames remained visible from the outside. The fire that had consumed the interior found itself extinguished by swamp water and terrain upon impact, but it had already done its damage long before that moment. For those monitoring the emergency from Miami, the sudden loss of radar return was an ominous silence that confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Air traffic controllers attempted repeated radio calls, their voices tight with urgency. ValuJet 592, Miami Center, do you copy? Static filled the channel. More calls followed. No response. None would ever come. The disappearance from radar was not a communications failure. It was the end of the aircraft's existence. At the airport, emergency coordination teams moved quickly, but the information coming in was fragmented and contradictory. Some reports suggested a possible ditching. Others mentioned smoke. Others still, a loss of altitude. But in the early minutes after the crash, nobody knew the exact location. The Everglades are vast, and the area where Flight 592 went down was particularly remote, accessible only by airboat or helicopter. Time became a weapon in the unfolding tragedy, denying rescuers the ability to reach the scene quickly. Helicopters from the Miami-Dade Fire Rescue Department rose into the afternoon sky, chopping through humid air as they headed west. From above, the Everglades resembled an endless mosaic of water channels, reeds, and small islands of vegetation. The silence below hid the violence that had just occurred. When the first helicopter reached the crash zone, the crew looked down upon a scene that was devastating in its clarity. Small pieces of metal, insulation, and wreckage floated on a shallow expanse of water, dispersed over a wide radius. There was no fuselage, no tail section, no recognizable cockpit. The aircraft had vaporized upon impact. Rescue teams scanned for any sign of survivors, any movement or signal. But the scale of destruction made it evident that the force of the crash had been unsurvivable. The swamp, thick with mud and sawgrass, covered what little remained. Even the largest fragments barely measured more than a few feet. Every expectation of finding survivors dissolved in the stark reality before them. Back at Miami International Airport, families waiting for loved ones began to sense something was terribly wrong. Airline personnel moved quietly through the terminals, pulling people aside, preparing courtyards for the inevitable briefing. At ValuJet's operations center, managers gathered around screens displaying emergency protocols. The company had been riding a wave of rapid growth, operating under a low-cost structure that depended heavily on outsourced maintenance and quick turnarounds. But none of that mattered now. The focus was on understanding what had gone wrong, and on supporting the families who would soon learn the harsh truth. Meanwhile, the crash site became the center of one of the most challenging recovery operations in modern aviation history. Airboats, helicopters, and amphibious vehicles converged on the marshland. Investigators from the NTSB began surveying the area, marking debris with colored flags, photographing wreckage from multiple angles, and trying to map the chaos into something coherent. The absence of large pieces made this task extraordinarily difficult. Nearly every component of the aircraft had been shattered or buried in mud, requiring meticulous excavation. As crews sifted through the wreckage, a disturbing pattern emerged. Scattered among pieces of metal and insulation were fragments of oxygen generators, twisted, charred, and ruptured. Some still had partial labels attached. Others were unrecognizable except for their distinct cylindrical shape. These discoveries prompted immediate questions. Why were these generators on board? Why were they in the forward cargo hold? And more importantly, had they played a role in the fire that preceded the crash? The investigation team began reconstructing the timeline based on the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, both of which were recovered after hours of searching and careful extraction. The voice recorder contained chilling evidence: the escalating stress in the cockpit, the crew's acknowledgement of smoke, and their attempt to return to Miami. The sound of alarms filled the background, punctuating the crew's increasingly frantic efforts to maintain control. One of the most unsettling parts of the recording was the rapid decline in the crew's communication clarity. Early in the emergency, the pilots exchanged crisp procedural phrases. But as smoke filled the cockpit and systems failed, their dialogue became fragmented. This deterioration was not due to incompetence, but to human limitations. In extreme conditions, especially when oxygen deprivation, heat, and sensory overload converge, the brain's ability to process information collapses. CRM, which depends on clear communication and mutual monitoring, began to fail simply because the human body could not cope with the environment. Yet, even as investigators uncovered the physiological challenges the crew faced, they also examined systemic issues in training and emergency preparedness. ValuJet was a fast-growing airline operating on a tight budget. Its reliance on outsourced maintenance meant that critical information sometimes passed through multiple layers of contractors before reaching decision-makers. This diffusion of responsibility created gaps that, in the case of Flight 592, had deadly consequences. As the investigation progressed, attention turned towards SabreTech, the maintenance contractor responsible for handling the oxygen generators. Interviews with employees revealed troubling details. Some workers recalled being instructed to remove the generators from other aircraft and prepare them for transport. They stated that they were told to cap the devices using safety caps, but the caps were in short supply. In some cases, makeshift caps were used. In others, devices were loaded without caps entirely. Layers of paperwork misidentified the hazardous components as non-dangerous materials. What emerged was a picture of systemic failure, one in which procedure, safety culture, and oversight had been eroded by shortcuts and assumptions. The airline trusted the maintenance contractor. The contractor trusted its employees. And the employees, many of whom lacked formal training in hazardous materials, relied on whatever instructions they had been given. At every level, belief in the adequacy of the system masked the fact that the system was deeply flawed. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the wreckage uncovered burn patterns consistent with a fast-moving, oxygen-fed fire. Investigators identified melted aluminum beams and charred insulation near the area where the oxygen generators had been stored. These findings aligned with the sequence captured on the cockpit recorder: the sudden smell of smoke, the rapid spread through the cabin, and the overwhelming heat that compromised structural integrity and avionics within minutes. What concerned investigators further was how quickly the crew became overtasked. With alarms sounding simultaneously and smoke impairing visibility, prioritization became nearly impossible. Even seasoned pilots struggle in such conditions, and Flight 592's cockpit became an environment where CRM could not operate as intended. The crew attempted to divide responsibilities, but the speed of system failures outpaced their ability to respond. The aircraft descended faster than their coordination could compensate for. This was not a failure of skill, but a failure of situational survivability. In parallel, the NTSB examined regulatory compliance. The DC-9's forward cargo hold was a Class D compartment, meaning it lacked fire suppression systems because it was assumed that any fire would quickly consume available oxygen and extinguish itself. This assumption became catastrophic when oxygen-producing devices were stored inside. The regulatory model had not anticipated a fire that could supply its own oxygen. This oversight revealed a vulnerability in both aircraft design and safety certification frameworks. As public attention focused on ValuJet, questions about the airline's maintenance practices intensified. Critics pointed to a rapid expansion strategy that strained resources and pushed the limits of operational stability. The FAA, in the spotlight, had to confront the fact that its oversight of ValuJet had been reactive, not preventive. The crash exposed weaknesses in regulatory enforcement, weaknesses that allowed high-risk practices to continue without intervention. In the days following the crash, the Everglades transformed into a temporary forensic zone. Investigators wore protective suits as they navigated waist-deep water and thick mud. Each recovered fragment was logged with precision. Every piece mattered, no matter how small. And as more oxygen generators were found, some intact, others violently ruptured, the evidence accumulated toward a singular, unavoidable conclusion. The fire had started in the forward cargo hold, and the oxygen generators had fueled it to catastrophic levels. The human toll of the disaster became a driving force behind the investigation. Families mourned openly, demanding answers. Aviation safety advocates called for immediate reforms. Politicians launched inquiries. But for the NTSB, the task remained clear: identify the root cause, determine contributing factors, and prevent such a tragedy from ever occurring again. The investigation uncovered that several opportunities for intervention had been missed. SabreTech's training programs did not adequately cover hazardous material handling. ValuJet's approval processes for accepting materials onto flights lacked verification protocols. The FAA had not enforced stricter oversight despite receiving warnings about maintenance problems. Each of these failures formed a link in the chain that ultimately led to disaster. As findings emerged, one conclusion gained prominence. The accident was the result of a preventable fire, fueled by improperly handled hazardous materials, compounded by a cargo compartment not designed to contain such a blaze, and exacerbated by cockpit conditions that overwhelmed the crew's ability to respond. As investigators pieced together the puzzle, the deeper systemic patterns began to surface with greater clarity. The tragedy of Flight 592 had not arisen from a single decision nor an isolated oversight, but from a layered failure of organizational communication, training, and regulatory vigilance. Every piece of debris recovered from the Everglades served as a reminder that aviation disasters are rarely spontaneous. They are built quietly, often invisibly, through accumulated vulnerabilities that remain dormant until triggered by the wrong combination of circumstances. The examination of maintenance logs revealed inconsistencies that initially appeared minor, but, on closer inspection, carried greater weight. Forms documenting the removal of oxygen generators from other aircraft did not indicate proper deactivation. Some logs noted that the devices were empty, a term that did not technically mean they were safe, but was used casually in the maintenance environment. Other documents lacked signatures or complete hazard labels. The culture at SabreTech, as interviews confirmed, operated under a mindset of speed and efficiency rather than caution. Productivity metrics overshadowed safety vigilance, not by malicious intent, but by habit, a silent drift in organizational norms that slowly allowed dangerous shortcuts to become routine. For the NTSB, understanding the broader context meant examining not only the physical evidence, but also the human environment in which mistakes germinated. Maintenance technicians described being understaffed, working long hours, and receiving minimal training on hazardous materials. Some recalled being asked to complete tasks for which they were not fully qualified. These testimonies painted a portrait of a workforce attempting to meet operational demands with tools and knowledge that were insufficient for the complexity of the systems they were entrusted to service. The safety caps, small plastic components meant to prevent the oxygen generators from triggering, became a central symbol of this breakdown. Investigators found multiple caps scattered among the wreckage, some unused, some damaged, some missing entirely. The absence of these caps meant that many generators were capable of activating with the slightest shock or friction. In a low-cost airline environment where outsourcing was common and turnover was high, the technical nuance surrounding such devices could easily be misunderstood. The oxygen generators were not inert metal cylinders. They were chemical mechanisms capable of sustaining combustion even in the absence of external oxygen. Mislabeling them as empty or harmless had set the stage for disaster long before they were loaded onto Flight 592. As the investigation moved toward analyzing the immediate circumstances of the fire, specialists reconstructed the physical environment of the cargo hold using both recovered materials and simulation models. Their findings revealed the remarkable speed at which the fire would have spread once activated. The forward cargo compartment's insulation, while effective in holding temperature and sound, was never designed to withstand a chemical fire producing its own oxygen. Within seconds of ignition, temperatures in the hold would have exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Smoke, thick and chemical-laden, would have pushed through seams in the flooring and ventilation passages leading into the cabin and cockpit. This matched the timeline in the cockpit voice recordings, where the crew noticed smoke almost immediately after takeoff. Investigators noted how the intensity of the blaze would have compromised structural elements quickly. Aluminum beams supporting the floor could reach their melting point within minutes. Cable bundles running beneath the cockpit, including those linked to avionics and control systems, would fail shortly after exposure to extreme heat. This explained the erratic instrument readings, the sudden alarms, and the loss of controllability that the crew experienced. The fire did not merely threaten the cabin environment, it actively destroyed the systems needed to fly the aircraft. Attention then shifted to the cockpit itself, where the final minutes of human struggle had unfolded. The NTSB's human performance specialist dissected every word, every pause, every sound captured on the cockpit voice recorder. The recording revealed a progressively overwhelming environment. In the first seconds after detecting smoke, both pilots communicated clearly. They coordinated the emergency turn, declared the situation to Miami Center, and attempted to run through the smoke evacuation checklist. But within less than a minute, their voices strained, forced through oxygen masks while alarms filled the audio channel. The checklist procedures, designed for manageable and compartmentalized emergencies, could not keep pace with the speed of the crisis. The rapid cognitive saturation of the pilots became evident. Under normal CRM protocols, one pilot would fly while the other managed radios and troubleshooting. But in Flight 592, the division of labor became blurred as the situation escalated beyond procedural bounds. Both pilots attempted to troubleshoot. Both attempted to interpret alarms. Both attempted to maintain control simultaneously. Their situational awareness fragmented under the onslaught of sensory and informational overload. This was CRM pushed past the threshold of feasibility, not because the pilots were unskilled, but because the environment itself had become incompatible with coordinated human performance. The NTSB's human factors analysis emphasized that cockpit crews are most vulnerable when emergencies escalate faster than checklists can accommodate. The pilots' cognitive load skyrocketed. Their ability to differentiate between relevant and irrelevant alarms collapsed. Smoke impaired their vision. Heat compromised their physical comfort. Oxygen deprivation clouded their judgment. All of these factors contributed to a cockpit environment where maintaining control became almost impossible. Yet, even with these overwhelming obstacles, the voice recorder demonstrated that the crew continued to fight with determination until the very end. Their final actions reflected professionalism under unimaginable pressure. The tragedy was not rooted in incompetence, but in the convergence of circumstances that rendered even the most capable human response insufficient. Parallel to the cockpit analysis, the NTSB investigators focused on reconstructing the airline's safety culture. ValuJet's operational philosophy, low cost, rapid expansion, and high utilization, placed heavy demands on maintenance cycles. While legal, the aggressive business model created pressure points where safety oversight had to be exceptionally strong to maintain reliability. Instead, investigators found vulnerabilities, documentation errors, gaps in hazard communication, inadequate training pipelines, a reliance on subcontractors who did not always meet the airline's safety expectations. These weaknesses did not directly cause the fire, but they created the environment in which such an oversight could occur. Scrutiny also turned toward the FAA itself. Reports revealed that the agency had received prior warnings from inspectors about ValuJet's maintenance record. Some inspectors noted repeated violations, deferred maintenance issues, and procedural inconsistencies. Yet enforcement actions were limited, whether due to resource constraints, bureaucratic inertia, or an overly collaborative regulatory model. The oversight system had failed to apply sufficient pressure to correct emerging risks. The crash of Flight 592 forced regulators to confront the consequences of leniency in environments where strict vigilance is essential. As investigators compiled their findings, public attention intensified. News outlets broadcast images of the Everglades crash site, highlighting the difficulty of recovery efforts. Families expressed anger, confusion, and grief. Many questioned how an aircraft could take off with hazardous materials on board. Others asked why the forward cargo hold had no fire suppression system. The investigation team understood that their work was not merely technical. It would shape the future of airline safety. Evidence mounted that the oxygen generators had been the initial and primary fuel source for the fire. Time of onset after takeoff matched the expected activation sequence. Chemical signatures found in the debris pointed to generator combustion. Burn patterns established the forward cargo compartment as the origin point. With each new data point, the the NTSB moved closer to an incontrovertible conclusion. The generators had ignited due to improper handling, inadequate hazard communication, and failures in maintenance procedure. In the final stages of the analysis, investigators presented a preliminary chain of causation. Oxygen generators without safety caps activated during flight. Fire erupted in a compartment not designed for such an event. Smoke overwhelmed cabin and cockpit. Structural and systems failures cascaded rapidly. Crew was incapacitated by environmental overload. Aircraft became uncontrollable. But the deeper narrative was more complex. Beneath each technical failure lay human and organizational factors. Undertraining, miscommunication, mislabeling, assumption, pressure, oversight gaps. The tragedy of ValuJet Flight 592 had emerged not from a singular mistake, but from a culture in which minor errors accumulated unnoticed until they manifested as catastrophe. As the investigation entered its concluding phases, the implications became clear. The lessons drawn from this disaster would have to reshape regulations, procedures, training programs, and oversight mechanisms. No single fix could prevent such tragedies. Only a systemic reinforcement of safety culture could. As the NTSB prepared for the public hearing phase of the investigation, the agency understood that the ValuJet crash was not merely a technical failure, but a watershed moment demanding accountability. Representatives from ValuJet, SabreTech, the FAA, and other stakeholders were summoned to provide testimony under oath. The hearing room became a stage where the full narrative of systemic collapse would be exposed, layer by layer, before families, journalists, and aviation professionals watching closely. The NTSB's findings were presented with stark clarity. Investigators outlined how the oxygen generators had been mislabeled as non-hazardous material, loaded without proper safety caps, and placed in a cargo hold incapable of containing a fire. They demonstrated how these failures created a scenario in which a chemical reaction became an unstoppable inferno. The board emphasized the speed at which the fire developed, underscoring that even a perfectly executed emergency response by the flight crew would have been unlikely to save the aircraft. The magnitude of the blaze, combined with the design limitations of the DC-9's cargo compartment, had stacked the odds against survival from the moment of ignition. In one particularly revealing segment, investigators showed a time-lapse simulation of an oxygen generator igniting under test conditions. The visual displayed a fiercely burning unit producing intense heat and pressurized oxygen, far more violent than any typical fire hazard. The demonstration illustrated how the generator, once activated, would burn relentlessly, its chemical core feeding itself in a closed-loop reaction. Members of the audience watched in disbelief as the fire accelerated instead of slowing, reaching temperatures that could melt structural aluminum in under a minute. The implications were devastating. The devices placed in Flight 592's cargo hold had contained the potential of a small industrial furnace, and the aircraft had carried dozens. During the testimony, SabreTech representatives attempted to explain their processes. They described a chaotic maintenance environment, insufficient guidance, and inadequate training on hazardous materials. Some technicians insisted they had been told that the generators were empty or harmless. Others recalled being rushed, pressured to complete tasks quickly to meet operational demands. The contradictions highlighted a broader cultural problem. Safety-critical components were being handled with casual familiarity rather than disciplined precision. ValuJet executives faced pointed questions as well. Investigators repeatedly asked why the airline had failed to detect hazardous materials during its cargo acceptance process. The company's representatives spoke about trust placed in contractors, cost pressures inherent to low-fare operations, and the challenges of rapid expansion. But none of these explanations absolved the airline of its responsibility. The hearing underscored a critical reality. When an airline outsources maintenance, it does not outsource accountability. FAA officials, too, were interrogated about oversight failures. The NTSB confronted them with internal memos from inspectors who had raised concerns about ValuJet before the crash, concerns that seemed to foreshadow the disaster. Some inspectors had questioned the airline's maintenance practices, warning that rapid growth could compromise safety, yet enforcement actions were limited. In the public hearing, the FAA defended its regulatory approach, but the tone was defensive. its reasoning threadbare in the face of so much evidence. The hearing laid bare the frailties of an interconnected system where every organization believed that someone else was responsible for ensuring safety. The result was a dangerous diffusion of accountability. Maintenance contractors believed the airline would verify cargo. The airline believed contractors understood hazardous material protocols. Regulators believed their inspectors had enough resources to monitor compliance. Each assumption added a layer of vulnerability. Together, they formed the invisible scaffolding that collapsed on May 11, 1996. As the investigation neared completion, the NTSB drafted its final report, an authoritative reconstruction of every contributing factor. The narrative was precise, unemotional, and rooted in forensic evidence. It began with the improper removal and handling of oxygen generators by SabreTech. It traced the device's mislabeling and transportation onto Flight 592. It examined the aircraft's forward cargo compartment, which lacked detection and suppression systems capable of addressing a chemical-fed fire. It analyzed the rapid failure of structural components and flight-critical systems due to extreme heat, and it documented the overwhelming environmental conditions that rendered the cockpit unmanageable. But the technical findings were only part of the story. The report also detailed human factors that intensified the tragedy: undertraining, poor hazard communication, inadequate supervision, organizational drift, regulatory gaps. These findings illustrated that aviation safety is not merely the sum of mechanical reliability, but the product of meticulous human coordination. The chain of errors that doomed Flight 592 demonstrated what happens when seemingly minor lapses accumulate unchecked. One of the most haunting insights from the investigation involved the recognition that the crew, despite their rapid response and professionalism, had been placed in an unwinnable scenario. The fire's intensity and speed were far beyond the scope of any standard emergency procedure. No pilot could have executed a checklist fast enough to counteract complete structural compromise. No crew could have coordinated effectively in an environment where smoke, heat, and system failures escalated within seconds. Their performance, though strained, reflected determination and courage. The tragedy was not rooted in their actions, but in the catastrophic environment into which they were thrust. In the months following the crash, the aviation community wrestled with the broader implications of the findings. Air carriers examined internal maintenance procedures with renewed scrutiny. Contractors implementing hazardous material protocols realized that their processes needed comprehensive overhaul. Regulators faced political and public pressure to fortify oversight mechanisms. The industry began a collective reckoning. ValuJet itself became the center of a national debate about the sustainability of rapid growth, low-cost business models in aviation. Could safety be maintained when operational demands expanded faster than infrastructure could support? The crash forced the airline to make significant changes. ValuJet temporarily grounded much of its fleet, underwent intense FAA scrutiny, and restructured its maintenance oversight processes. Financial losses mounted as the company attempted to regain public trust. Eventually, ValuJet merged with AirTran Airways, adopting a new identity partly shaped by lessons from Flight 592. While the airline later grew into a successful operation, the legacy of the disaster never faded from its institutional memory. For SabreTech, the consequences were more severe. The company faced criminal charges for mishandling hazardous materials and falsifying maintenance records. While individuals within the organization felt the weight of the prosecution, the broader message was aimed at the entire industry. Maintenance contractors bear direct responsibility for the lives affected by their work. The case marked a turning point in how the aviation sector viewed third-party accountability. On the regulatory side, the FAA enacted sweeping reforms influenced directly by the findings of the investigation. Cargo compartments previously classified as Class D were re-examined. Many were reclassified and required to include smoke detection and fire suppression systems. Airlines were mandated to improve hazardous material training programs. Cargo acceptance procedures were rewritten to ensure that mislabeled components could not make their way onto passenger flights. The era of trusting declarations without verification came to an abrupt end. These reforms reflected a broader shift. Safety could no longer be maintained through assumptions. Every link in the chain, from maintenance shop to cargo hold to cockpit, had to be hardened against failure. The vulnerability exploited by the Flight 592 accident was systemic, and only systematic reinforcement could close the gap. Meanwhile, the Everglades, silent witness to the tragedy, became a place of reflection. Investigators continued to comb the swamp for months, recovering debris and identifying remains. Families visited memorial sites, leaving flowers, photos, and handwritten notes. The isolation of the crash site created a stark metaphor. The disaster, though rooted in human systems, ended in a place far removed from civilization, as though nature itself had absorbed the final impact. As reconstruction of the aircraft progressed within hangars, investigators arranged fragments on grids, aligning twisted aluminum ribs, melted wires, charred insulation, and ruptured cylinders. This patchwork reconstruction allowed analysts to determine the exact position of each oxygen generator in the cargo hold. They identified scorch marks on surrounding materials, burn-through points in aluminum panels, and heat deformation in structural components. These subtle clues formed a three-dimensional map of the fire's progression. The reconstruction demonstrated unequivocally that the blaze originated among the improperly stored oxygen generators and expanded with lethal speed. The cockpit components, though heavily damaged, provided further insight. Instrument clusters showed signs of heat distortion, with some units partially melted. Wiring harnesses were severed in multiple locations, their insulation burned away. The flight control cables displayed fraying patterns consistent with exposure to extreme temperatures. These details reinforced the conclusion that the fire's intensity had crippled the aircraft's ability to sustain controlled flight. Throughout the findings, investigators found themselves repeatedly drawn to the human dimension. The tragedy revealed vulnerabilities not only in machinery, but in communication and training. The chain of events began with a misunderstanding of hazardous material protocols and ended with pilots overwhelmed by conditions no training had fully prepared them to face. The investigation highlighted how critical it is for every individual in the aviation system to understand the gravity of their role. As the NTSB finalized its report, the agency prepared to deliver one of the most consequential documents in modern aviation history. The task was not to assign blame in isolation, but to articulate the full, interconnected framework of failures that led to the destruction of ValuJet Flight 592. The final report, when released, would become a blueprint for structural change, a detailed account of how systems, when left unchecked, can drift into dangerous territory even without malicious intent. In its conclusion, the board stated plainly that the probable cause of the accident was the fire in the forward cargo compartment, fueled by oxygen generators improperly prepared and loaded by SabreTech. It also identified contributing factors: ValuJet's failure to oversee its contractors, the FAA's inadequate oversight of both entities, and the aircraft's outdated cargo compartment design, which lacked the modern fire detection and suppression systems that might have offered the crew at least a fighting chance. These findings carried significant weight. They exposed vulnerabilities that were not unique to ValuJet but present, in varying degrees, across the industry. For many observers, the tragedy of Flight 592 marked a turning point in understanding how commercial aviation had evolved. The rapid expansion of low-cost carriers had transformed air travel, making it more accessible than ever. But with this growth came increased reliance on subcontractors, accelerated turnaround times, and business models that demanded relentless efficiency. The accident revealed how quickly such pressures could undermine safety when not balanced with rigorous oversight and disciplined procedures. It demonstrated that aviation's safety record, a triumph earned through decades of engineering and procedural improvements, remained fragile if the human systems responsible for maintaining it were neglected. The regulatory response was swift and far-reaching. The FAA mandated the elimination of Class D cargo compartments across the entire U.S. fleet, requiring airlines to retrofit their aircraft with fire detection and suppression capabilities. This single mandate alone represented one of the largest safety-driven fleet modifications in commercial aviation history. Thousands of airplanes underwent redesign and refit, and the era of unmonitored cargo spaces effectively ended. Training protocols underwent major reconstruction as well. Airlines were required to implement comprehensive hazardous materials programs not only for maintenance personnel, but also for frontline employees involved in loading and accepting cargo. The new curriculum went beyond classroom theory, incorporating hands-on demonstrations, real-case analyses, and scenario-based evaluations that made clear the consequences of procedural lapses. Employees handling materials like chemical oxygen generators were trained extensively on their properties, risks, and proper containment. The casual assumptions that once permeated maintenance environments were replaced with a culture grounded in documentation, verification, and accountability. ValuJet itself became emblematic of the crisis. The airline struggled to rebuild trust in the aftermath of the disaster. Its temporary grounding extended for months, and its financial losses mounted. Public confidence had evaporated, competitors surged ahead, and regulators kept the company under constant scrutiny. Ultimately, ValuJet merged with AirTran Airways, adopting a new organizational structure and identity. Though the merged airline would eventually flourish, the shadow of Flight 592 remained embedded in its historical narrative, a reminder that reputational damage in aviation is often irreversible when safety failures occur. SabreTech faced criminal prosecution, a rarity in aviation. While the company as an entity was found guilty on some counts, the trials of individual employees produced more mixed results, highlighting the complexity of assigning personal culpability within a flawed organizational system. Yet the prosecutions sent a clear message. Maintenance providers carry moral and legal responsibility for the integrity of the components they handle. The message reverberated throughout the industry. Companies reevaluated their safety cultures, implemented more stringent quality control policies, and increased investment in employee training. Even those not directly involved with hazardous materials saw in Flight 592 an example of how oversight at any level could determine the fate of an entire aircraft. The FAA, facing its own reckoning, conducted internal reviews that led to structural changes in oversight philosophy. Resource allocation increased for field inspectors. Protocols for identifying high-risk carriers were rewritten. Enforcement divisions adopted a more proactive stance, targeting systemic vulnerabilities rather than isolated violations. While not all reforms were perfect, the overall shift marked a meaningful strengthening of regulatory rigor. As all these changes unfolded, the broader aviation community reflected deeply on the human dimension. The crew of ValuJet Flight 592 became symbols of professionalism confronted with impossible odds. Their voices on the cockpit voice recorder, strained, determined, committed to saving their passengers, served as a haunting reminder of the pressures pilots face when cascading system failures occur. Training programs across the industry began integrating lessons from the human factors analysis. CRM modules grew to emphasize not only communication and task division, but also recognizing and mitigating cognitive overload, especially in fast-escalating emergencies. Pilots were taught not only what to do, but how to maintain clarity when conditions become overwhelming. In the years that followed, additional safety enhancements emerged indirectly from the accident's legacy. Airlines invested more heavily in automated monitoring systems capable of detecting fire signatures. Cargo packaging protocols evolved to include more robust fire-resistant materials. The industry's approach to outsourcing shifted as well. Carriers began implementing stricter audits of contractor facilities, insisting on documented compliance rather than verbal assurances. From ground crews to flight crews, the message became unmistakable. Every task, no matter how mundane, carries consequences for the lives aboard an aircraft. And yet, despite all the reforms, the story of Flight 592 continued to resonate for a more personal reason. The passengers and crew were mothers, fathers, children, professionals, students, ordinary individuals whose lives ended in a matter of minutes because of unseen failures. Their absence fueled the urgency of change. At memorial services, families gathered to honor their loved ones, reading names carved into stone and setting flowers against windswept markers. The quiet of the Everglades, broken only by rustling grass and distant wildlife, served as a solemn backdrop, a place both beautiful and haunting, where the magnitude of loss could be felt without words. Investigators who worked on the case often reflected on how the accident changed their understanding of aviation safety. For many, it represented the clearest example of how this Swiss cheese model of failure operates in real life. Multiple layers of defense, maintenance protocols, hazard labeling standards, regulatory oversight, aircraft design features had aligned their weaknesses in a precise and deadly configuration. The oxygen generators themselves were not new technology. The DC-9 was not inherently unsafe. The crew was trained and competent. Yet when holes appeared in several layers of the system simultaneously, they formed a path straight through to disaster. This framework became a central teaching tool in preventing future accidents. The legacy of Flight 592 also influenced how future investigators approached accidents involving maintenance errors and cargo issues. The case established precedents in forensic methodology, emphasizing the need for interdisciplinary teams that could analyze chemistry, materials science, human factors, regulatory structure, organizational psychology, and aeronautical engineering as interconnected components. Crashes were no longer viewed solely through the lens of mechanical failure or pilot error. Instead, they were examined as emergent outcomes of complex systems where human decisions were inseparable from technical contexts. As years passed, the tragedy of Flight 592 continued to shape safety landscapes in subtle but profound ways. Pilots reviewed its sequence during recurrent training, studying the crew's communication under duress. Maintenance technicians heard its story during onboarding sessions, learning the importance of proper labeling and component handling. Regulators referenced it when designing new compliance frameworks. Historians cited it as a pivotal moment in the evolution of modern aviation oversight. The accident became part of the collective memory of the industry, a reference point, a lesson, a warning. In this sense, the passengers and crew of Flight 592 left behind a legacy far larger than the tragedy itself. Their loss became the catalyst for structural improvements that protected millions of travelers who would one day board aircraft unaware of how their safety had been strengthened. Every added fire suppression system, every improved training module, every tightened maintenance audit, every revised regulatory policy represented a commitment to ensuring that the conditions leading to May 11th, 1996 could never align again. And so, the story of ValuJet Flight 592 became not only a narrative of disaster, but a testament to aviation's capacity to learn, adapt, and evolve. The skies grew safer because the industry confronted its failures head-on. It strengthened defenses, acknowledged vulnerabilities, and redefined the standards by which safety is measured. In the final reflection, one truth endures. Every flight carries within it the accumulated lessons of past tragedies. Every checklist, every inspection, every design improvement is a safeguard written by lives lost. Flight 592 stands among those lessons, etched deeply, indelibly, into the fabric of aviation history. Because in the world of flight, every incident, every misstep, every oversight becomes part of a larger story. A story written not only in data and metal, but in the resolve to protect those who step aboard an aircraft with trust. Every flight has a story, and this one left a lesson written in the skies.